This week on The Communicators, our guest is Representative Anna Eshoo, ranking member on the House Telecommunications Subcommittee. She joins us to talk about several issues currently being discussed in Congress regarding telecommunications policy.
And now joining us from the U.S. Capitol is Representative Anna Eshoo, a Democrat of California and the ranking member of the Telecommunications Subcommittee in the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Eshoo, thank you for being on the Communicators. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm delighted.
Several issues are working their way through Congress right now, technology policy, and I want to start with one of the bills that's working its way right now through the Senate, and that's the cybersecurity bill. Your committee just held a hearing on cybersecurity last week. Have you had a chance to look at the Senate bill, and what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I think that the Senate is a little ahead of us on this. I am one of the original co-sponsors of cybersecurity legislation that Congressman Mike Rogers, who chairs the Intelligence Committee, we work together at the Intelligence Committee, even though I'm not a member there any longer. But that really applies to a slice relative to the intelligence community, and that's a good bill. When it comes to our committee, our subcommittee, I don't think we're ready for a bill yet. We had our first hearing last week, and I think all of the members on both sides of the aisle felt that it was one of the best hearings in terms of witnesses and information that we've ever had. So there is a lot to draw from in terms of what the witnesses, how instructive and how informative they were to us. But I don't think we're quite ready for a bill yet. But we should get to it. We must get to it because our nation's telecommunications networks need to be secure. And I just can't imagine any of that ever going down. And of course, what was described to us last week was rather chilling in terms of what could be done to relative to cybersecurity issues and our telecommunications networks in the country.
Do you see cybersecurity legislation making it through this second session of the 112th Congress?
Well, there's an old saw around here that not very much gets done during a presidential election year. I like to set things like that aside because I love to get things done. So I'm going to work on it with the chairman, and I made that commitment to him, and I know that he has that commitment as well. Let's see how far we can get.
Also joining us here on the Communicators is Tony Romm of Politico.
Thanks for having me. To continue on the topic of cybersecurity, one of the things we're hearing a lot from the civil liberties community is the extent to which the Department of Homeland Security would take a leading role in setting the standards on cybersecurity. That's from the Senate bill released this week. Are you comfortable with the level of involvement that DHS would have in this space in determining what critical infrastructure would be and working with those entities to determine what they have to do to secure themselves in the event of a cyber emergency?
Well, I think that there are two words that immediately come to mind: Homeland Security, and then the issues that people care they care about security. Obviously, that's our number one responsibility as members of Congress. But we also have to balance this out relative to privacy and civil liberties. I know what these issues are because we struggled mightily with them at the House Intelligence Committee. You can't leave security out, but you can't betray or push the Constitution aside either. So I think that what we're probably going to see is committees of various jurisdictions coming up with bills that deal with slices of the responsibility. There isn't one agency that's in charge of cybersecurity. Now, I don't know whether that's a blessing or a burden. It could speak to overlap in some places, but I think that if the overall effort is well coordinated, that you get closer to having a very balanced view rather than one that isn't.
Sure. One of the big questions when it comes to information sharing in particular is whether entire communication streams might be intercepted and shared among the players. And more than that, if the data collected could be used for prosecutions. That's some of the issues raised by the ACLU and some others. Do you think the Senate bill strikes the right balance, or do you think there has to be some work done in that area?
I still think we have work to be done in that area. For some reason, it's not what we start out with, and there's a heavy weight that has continued to, that the country has continued to carry since we were attacked. I think we weren't so interested in these issues when it wasn't on the homeland. And so that's legitimate, but I know that it is very delicate, but very important to be able to combine the two. That's what I will look for, and I think that the yardstick by which I measure legislation is that it needs to be a combination of the two.
Representative Eshoo represents Silicon Valley up in Northern California, and one of the issues that she's been working with is the privacy, or the piracy issue, and the SOPA, PIPA piracy issue, something that's of concern to her constituents up there. Congresswoman, do you see action coming on that issue?
Well, there was a lot of action before the end of the year, and that all came to a screeching halt when members of Congress from across the country heard from their constituents about how strongly they felt about the public interest, how this would affect the internet, how it would affect free speech, how it would affect cybersecurity, how it would affect the future of the internet. So it's in many ways it's come to a screeching halt. So the problem has not been resolved. The country is still faced with essentially the hijacking of American genius. And that isn't acceptable to anyone. Now, the SOPA bill, in my view, was so broad, I don't even think it ever was going to work. And if it did, it was so broad it would inflict a great deal of damage. But I'm on alternate legislation that takes things in a different direction. But I think all the stakeholders are going to have to sit down and help work this out. So I'm glad that the SOPA bill was stopped in its tracks because it was moving very, very, very quickly. Most members didn't even know what was in it, most frankly, even if they were co-sponsors. So that tells you something. But we have a problem that needs to be resolved. I don't want to see one winner and one loser in this, because it really represents, in terms of Southern California and the genius and the creativity of the artists that are there, the innovation and the creativity that has come out of Silicon Valley and gives us world standing in both areas. This needs to be worked out, and I think that it can be. I can't tell you the date or the time, but I think that we can move on to another track, always keeping in mind that none of us are for the hijacking of American genius.
This has really turned into a Southern California versus Northern California fight, hasn't it?
Well, some have characterized it that way. I think of myself as a Californian, and I'm very proud of what our nation state represents. But it goes beyond the borders. California is home to both of these giants, as it were, in terms of what it represents, creativity and innovation, and of course it's known and embraced around the world. But this is something that affects our entire country. So it doesn't just reside in the state of California. We are home to this innovation and creativity, and I want to see that it continues. Infringement and copyright is one of the essentials, not only in our Constitution, but that has been the mark of every chapter of American history. So I just think that the SOPA bill was far, far too broad. We have to come up with a vehicle that is going to speak to the case of piracy, but allow for both to move forward and succeed. And if they do, then we'll know that we came up with the right thing.
Sure. To shift gears a little bit, another one of the topics, another one of the issues you followed most closely is spectrum reform.
Yes.
And as you and I speak here today, lawmakers are hashing out what could be a final compromise on the payroll tax bill. And one of the pay-fors for unemployment insurance in particular could be spectrum reform. Now, I know it's early in the process, but have you gotten any indication of what this spectrum proposal might look like?
I don't have the details of it. This changes almost by the hour. So by the time this program is broadcast, we may know the exact answer. At this moment, I don't. What I do know is that spectrum, even when there was the super committee, the reason there was an interest on the part of legislators and members of these very important committees, today, the conferees, is because there's money there. So there's always going to be interest wherever dollars are being generated. And of course, in the House spectrum bill, as well as in the Senate, we established a means by which spectrum can be sold, auctioned on a voluntary basis, which Republicans and Democrats on a bipartisan basis, we agreed to that. And that will generate billions of dollars to the federal government. So how much of that will be used as a pay-for, I don't know. But I've spent the better part of this year working on spectrum legislation, which is so important for the future of the country. We know everything is, so much is moving toward to wireless. We know that these new platforms and apps need a spectrum, and we want to be able to create the platforms for the future of our country. And I think that smart spectrum includes not only licensed, but unlicensed as well. And I've been quite outspoken about that. And I'd like to see that included in the final legislation, because there are enormous opportunities for innovators, for patients in terms of medical devices and records and access, for the smart grid in terms of energy. So I don't want to lose that opportunity, especially in the TV white spaces relative to unlicensed. And it has enormous potential, and it represents anywhere from $16 to $37 billion a year in terms of businesses. So I want to make sure that we keep our eye on the future and not just do what we're doing today, but that the bill really reflect where we need to go, and that we provide the platforms and what's necessary to be part of that platform. Thank you for asking that, because that's all I've lived, especially for all this year.
Let's actually dig a little bit into this issue of unlicensed. You and Congressman Darrell Issa and dozens others wrote to the conference committee recently to express not only interest in an unlicensed spectrum, but a desire that it be protected in the final proposal that they put together. But one of the things that House Republicans in particular have said is, hey, we've got a deficit problem on our hands. We have to get the money from somewhere. And so the machination that they've put forward would see money essentially coming into the U.S. government for unlicensed use, which the biggest supporters of unlicensed say, essentially hurts the entire premise of unlicensed. So I guess the question is this: is there a way to balance the need to keep unlicensed spectrum preserved with the need to bring more money into the federal government to address this growing deficit problem?
Well, that's certainly one view that you expressed. This immediate issue at hand that's being dealt with by the conferees is by no means going to address the national deficit and the debt. That's a very long-term policy. I think that the number one economic booster in the country is full employment. And so what I'm looking for in this is to pave the way for America's future. And I think that we should be number one in broadband. I think we should be number one in opportunities in the unlicensed area. We already see what unlicensed has unleashed, everything from Wi-Fi to Bluetooth. And 20 years ago, no one would have ever known what we were talking about if we used those terms. So you can put a green eye shade on, get out your pencil out of your plastic holder in your white shirt, short sleeve pocket, and get into counting beans in this. Or you can say, look, we're going to be bringing in a lot of money to the federal government with the voluntary auctions because Spectrum is gold. Spectrum is gold. You can't go to Neiman Marcus and buy Spectrum. You can't go to Macy's. You can't go to Nordstrom. It's the Congress that has to do the allocation. And it seems to me that we need to create the atmospherics for a 21st century America where innovation is absolutely bubbling up constantly. Now, if you remove the opportunity of unlicensed, and we're talking $2 billion here, come on. I think America is far more of an important idea than that. I understand, and it's a challenge to have the kind of debt and deficit that hangs over our heads. But there's going to be considerable sums of money brought in, I believe, with the voluntary auction. That's going to be a very good down payment relative to the committee that I'm on. I wish all committees in Congress would produce something that the House Energy and Commerce Committee is producing relative to real bucks. So I think that one view is the long view about America. We really take a stand that we're going to be number one in everything. And then there's the short-term view that you mentioned. I prefer the former.
Sure. Flip side of that, of course, is voluntary incentive auctions here. And one of the debates that we've seen play out over the last couple months, actually, is what conditions should be on the FCC with respect to selling those airwaves to private companies. Now, we don't know what the final plan is going to look like, and it might be out by the time that we ultimately air. But if you look down the road a little bit, is there anything that can be done to assuage the concerns of telecom companies or lawmakers who think that the FCC might not handle auctions appropriately? I know you and some other Democrats have said that the agency should conduct auctions the way it has for many years now. Is there a way to kind of reach a middle ground on those two issues, even without legislation?
Well, I think that what certainly guides my thinking is the following, that the FCC takes steps to make sure that there is true, real, honest-to-God competition in the country. There are some that talk a good game about competition, but once they see it coming toward them from 1,000 miles away, it's like fire, fire, house on fire. What serves the public interest? There are so many technical issues that are a part of my work at the subcommittee. But you have to have a rudder in all of this about what counts, what is going to guide you. For me, it's the public interest, certainly competition, and the opportunity for people to really compete locally, regionally, nationally. I think that is at the heart of what we're supposed to do. I think that is part of the mission of the FCC. So I don't think that in terms of doing any kind of reforms relative to the FCC, that I don't think should be tinkered with, because then you'll be tearing the heart out of, the real heart, the core of what the FCC is there to do.
You're watching C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guest this week is Representative Anna Eshoo, the ranking member of the House Telecommunications Subcommittee. Our guest reporter is Tony Romm from the Politico. Representative Eshoo joins us from the Capitol. And just to continue our discussion on Spectrum, Congresswoman, how far apart or close together are you and your subcommittee chairman, Greg Walden, on this issue of Spectrum right now?
Well, I think that we have a different view about unlicensed. in the TV white spaces. And I think that we haven't come to a total agreement. You know that we did agree on many different parts of the bill, which is wonderful, and that's the way it should be, because these are not partisan issues. They're difference of viewpoints, of approaches. That we have a national interoperable public safety network for our country, finally. That the 9/11 Commission called for this. We finally have gotten to it. And there is agreement about the D block. Where we have some difference of opinion is about a governing body relative to that effort. So I hope that we can come to an agreement on that. And I hope that by the end of this legislative year, that we'll have a bill that we can send to the president and have him sign it. Because, again, this whole issue that we're working on under the umbrella of Spectrum contains so many elements that are so important for the American people. They're going to benefit from it. And enormous economic opportunities. And I think those are the two things that we need to keep that's the main thing that I want to keep my eye on and have.
Well, when it comes to auctioning off more spectrum, aren't we already behind the 8 ball as far as timing? I mean, we're already seeing shortages of spectrum in many metro areas.
We are. That's why this needs to get done. And once the legislation becomes law, it still takes time from the time that spectrum is auctioned for the various companies to tee up, essentially. I've been told in some cases from 5 to 7 years. So we don't have a moment to waste in this. I think it's been an exciting effort to be a part of. You say the word spectrum to most people and they don't get very excited about it. But when you tell them how it works in their lives and the applications and the potential for future applications, they find it not only interesting but very exciting.
You mentioned 5 to 7 years for incentive auctions. Some have said it could be up to a decade before a public safety network can cover 98, 99% of the country, with that D block spectrum that lawmakers have advocated for using for public safety. So what does Congress do over the course of the next couple years to ensure that this all proceeds, according to the time frame and gets done in an amount of time in which public safety has resources to communicate before there's a huge natural disaster like the ones that ultimately prompted the call for a public safety network in the first place?
Well, I'm always reminded that time is the most precious thing that's given to us. In our day-to-day lives, certainly our legislative lives. Look how long it has taken to even address the issue that the 9/11 Commission called on the Congress to do, and that is to have a nationwide interoperable public safety network. So that time is lost. But I have a lot of confidence in what the American people can do and what the private sector has the capacity to do. Number one, I think Congress has to stay on this. One of the most important things we do is oversight. And so you have to bring people in that are the stakeholders and the movers and the shakers in each one of these areas. And by the very fact that you bring them in and the Congress is asking questions and keeping our pedal to the metal on how important this is and that we want it done as quickly as possible, I think will help it along. If we're lackadaisical about it, if we don't pay attention to it, if we move on forgetting about it, then that might be the attitude that sets in. But we can't afford to do that.
Congresswoman, do your 9/11 call centers proposal for text and video, is that a short-term solution?
Well, it's not a short-term solution. We have call centers, as you know, and as the listeners know, all over the country. And I remember working in the call center when we had the huge earthquake in California in 1989 when I was in local government. I went downstairs in that county government center and worked in that call center all night. So this is an effort to bring the call centers into the 21st century, so that text and video and all of that can be a part of them. Now, there is going to be a debate about how much the funding will be, and depending on how much we can secure, that will depend on how much of a change will take place sooner rather than later, or later rather than sooner. I've been working on this for a long time. I think that this is the first place that people call. If they dial 911, parents even teach their small children, if there's something wrong, this is what you should do. This is the number to dial. So in many cases, it's the difference between life and death. So I think our call centers deserve our attention, and they deserve to have a share of funding. Certainly the federal government is not going to pick up the tab for the whole thing. We can't. But there should be state and local dollars that are a part of this. But it is an overall effort to make sure that our call centers are 21st century call centers.
Tony Romm.
Congresswoman, one more spectrum-related question for you. The big news this week involves LightSquared, and essentially the company is in a bit of a bind after the FCC has essentially said it cannot proceed in the way that it had planned. Mm-hmm. So the question for you is, first, did the FCC handle this process correctly over the course of the years in which it analyzed LightSquared and issued its determination this week? And second, what are the lessons going forward, not just for LightSquared, but for the wireless space generally?
Well, I think I just learned about this, that the result of the testing relative to LightSquared and its technology, that the FCC made the determination that there would be interference that was serious enough to displace the LightSquared proposal. I understand the great blessings of GPS. I think I know that I have a company in my district that may even be the father of GPS. So I know it. I appreciate it. I know what it's done for the military. I know what it's done in civil life. But I also thought that LightSquared had an exciting proposal. I certainly hope that I trust that the FCC created and carried out a totally unbiased testing of this. But I think that the overall question now is, how do we make sure that we have broadband that penetrates every single area of our country? We are not there yet, and shame on us for not being there. We should not be self-congratulatory when we are ranked either 16th, 17th, or 24th in the world on broadband penetration. The United States of America should be number one, and that certainly is my goal. So we'll move along past this. I know that the military raised a lot of questions about it, but I certainly hope that everything that was conducted, and I'm not suggesting that it wasn't, that it would have been totally unbiased, and that this is a scientific and engineering decision that was rendered as a result of the tests, and that spells out the rest of the story.
And finally, Congresswoman, there's been talk up in Congress about reforming the FCC model as it exists. What reforms, if any, would you like to see?
Well, I think that legislation that my Republican partner, John Shimkus of Illinois, and myself have offered to our colleagues, and we have very good bipartisan support on that bill, as well as the agreement of various former members of the FCC to FCC members of today, and that is that they be able to talk to each other. They need to collaborate. Their staffs need to be able to do that. I think that that's a reform that deserves the support of the full Congress, the House, the Senate. We should get that in the bill and get it to the president and have him sign it into law. There are some other suggestions, but I worry about them because the last thing we need is to take the hands of an agency and tie them behind their back and say, okay, now go and function and produce for the American people. Where some of these ideas where they just tie the place up in litigation for years and years. That's not a reform. So I'll look to the things that are really doable, always in the public interest, and that I don't think we want to get in the way of competition, and the FCC has to assure that we have real competition in the country. The American consumer is the one that will benefit from that. Now, sometimes there are stakeholders that don't like that, and we may work with them on some things and not agree with them on others. But we're here for the American people, and so is the FCC. And so those are some of the things that I'd like to see protected. On the other hand, reform and full disclosure and reviewing how they use their money, of course we should review that. I think that's Congress's role to do that, and I don't have any objections to that.
And we are out of time. Representative Anna Eshoo is the ranking member of the Telecommunications Subcommittee in the House of Representatives, and she has joined us from the Capitol for this edition of the Communicators, as has our guest reporter, Tony Romm of Politico. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.